Welcome back, explorers of the unknown. This is Mr. Geronimo. Subscribe, press like, and comment your country before we begin. My name is Eric Ward, and I am a park ranger with the Appalachian National Forest Service. I have spent the last 14 years protecting and monitoring the mountain ranges that span across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. I have seen bears, storms, and lost hikers. I have pulled people from canyons and guided rescue teams through whiteout conditions. But nothing in my career prepared me for what happened during that summer expedition, and nothing could have predicted the horror that would unfold in the depths of those ancient mountains. This story begins on July 12th, when 6 of us gathered at the Ridgeline Base Camp at sunrise. The weather was perfect, clear skies, cool temperatures, no rain in the forecast. We had planned this expedition for 3 months. The goal was simple enough: to map out a series of new hiking trails in the remote northern section of Blackfang Valley, an area that rarely saw visitors. The valley had earned its name centuries ago from early settlers who spotted what they believed were massive black wolves with elongated jaws. The locals still told stories. The rangers laughed them off. Our group consisted of a careful mix of experience and enthusiasm. I was leading the expedition naturally. Then there was Catherine Hughes, who was 58 years old and had been a wildlife biologist for 32 years. She moved like a woman half her age, with an efficiency and quiet observation that I respected deeply. She was the kind of scientist who asked questions instead of making assumptions. Next was Larry Price, 71 years old, who had been a surveyor and cartographer for the Department of Interior. His hands were gnarled from decades of field work, but his mind was sharp as flint. He carried maps in his head the way other people carried photographs. Christina Butler, 40 years old, was a photographer commissioned by the National Park Service to document the lesser-known regions of the Appalachians. She had a good eye and an even better sense of timing. She had hiked with me before, 3 years earlier, and I knew she could handle herself in difficult terrain. Patrick Barnes was 65, a retired mining engineer who had spent decades below the earth before he decided to spend his remaining years above it, exploring the surface he had never properly appreciated. He was quiet but competent. And finally, there was Janet Foster, 47, a freelance journalist who was writing a piece on the forgotten wilderness areas of Eastern America. She had the kind of curiosity that made her ask questions at unexpected moments. We were all experienced outdoors people. We all knew the risks. We all dismissed the old stories as superstition. We left camp at 6 in the morning. The trail into Blackfang Valley was marked, at least for the first 6 miles. After that, we would be making our own path, following Larry's maps and my compass work. The forest that morning was beautiful in a way that defies description. The light filtered through the canopy in long, golden beams. The air smelled of rich earth and growing things. Birds called from above, and the sound of a stream running somewhere to our east provided a constant, gentle soundtrack to our movement. For the first 3 hours, conversation came easily. Catherine and Christina discussed the ecosystem we were moving through. They pointed out indicator plants, species that suggested the elevation, the soil composition, the historical land use patterns. Patrick walked in comfortable silence. Larry consulted his maps frequently and made notes. Janet asked questions constantly, her voice bright with the kind of energy that comes from doing work you genuinely love. I walked at the front of our group, setting the pace. My job was to watch for hazards, loose rocks, sudden drop-offs, unmarked side trails that could lead hikers astray. I was also there to manage our movement, to decide when to stop for water, when to push forward, when the time had come to make camp. That responsibility weighed on me now, as it always did. When something went wrong in the wilderness, the ranger in charge was the one who bore the guilt. At 9 in the morning, we reached what I called the confluence point, where 2 major streams converged. This was an optimal place to take our first significant break. We had covered nearly 8 miles, and everyone needed water and rest. I called for a stop, and we all descended to the stream to refill our bottles and eat the packed lunches we had brought. It was here that I first noticed something unusual. The stream should have been flowing north, following the natural grade of the land toward the river valley below. But it was flowing east instead. That was odd. Larry noticed it too. He pulled out his maps and frowned. According to his surveys, this creek had always flowed north. We both stood there, looking at the water moving against the expected direction, and we could offer no explanation. Catherine noticed our expressions. "What is it?" she asked. "The water flow," I said. It is wrong. She knelt by the stream and touched the current, feeling its strength and direction. Then she studied the banks, looking at the vegetation and the erosion patterns. It has not always flowed this way, she said finally. The banks would show different wear patterns if this were recent. But the flow direction does suggest a shift in water table pressure. Perhaps a landslide higher up. Maybe during last year's heavy storms. It was a reasonable explanation. I accepted it because I wanted to accept it. We finished our lunch and resumed our hike. By 1 in the afternoon, we had pushed deeper into the valley. The mountains around us had grown more substantial, rising in massive domes of rock and vegetation. The trees here were different too, older, larger, with trunks that suggested they had been growing for 200 years or more. The canopy became so thick that the sunlight barely penetrated. We moved in a perpetual twilight, and I noticed that our voices sounded different in that dimness. They seemed to carry less far, as though the shadows were absorbing our words. It was Christina who first mentioned the sound. "Do you hear that?" she asked, stopping abruptly. We all halted. I strained to listen past the usual forest noises, the wind in the leaves, the distant call of crows, the ambient hum of insects. And then I heard it too, a low rumble, very faint, coming from somewhere to the north. It sounded like distant thunder, but the sky visible through the canopy was completely clear. "Wind patterns in the valley," Patrick suggested. "Sound traveling strangely through the mountains." But Larry was already checking his instruments. He had brought a sensitive seismograph, a small portable device that detected earth vibrations. "There is actually some tremor," he said, studying the readout. "Very subtle, but measurable. Perhaps minor tectonic activity." "Earthquakes are not common here," Catherine said. "No," Larry agreed. "But they do happen. The Appalachians are old, but they still move." We resumed hiking, but the sound continued. That distant rumble that never resolved into thunder. Every 15 minutes or so, it would sound again, muffled and vague, coming from a direction that seemed to shift. I found myself constantly checking my compass to make sure we were maintaining our bearing. There was something about that sound that made me uneasy, something that bypassed logic and went directly to the ancient part of my brain that remembered when mountains were not refuges but dangers. We made camp that night in a small clearing near a tributary stream. The clearing was flat and relatively protected, with adequate water nearby. We established a proper camp, tents arranged in a defensive pattern, a central fire pit, a food cache hung from a tree branch to keep it away from scavenging animals. By the time darkness fell completely, the temperature had dropped significantly. At this elevation, even in July, night brought a chill. We sat around our fire, eating rehydrated meals that tasted better than they had any right to. The conversation had become more subdued. The rumbling sound had grown louder as evening fell, more frequent. It was no longer possible to explain it away as wind or distant weather. "There is definitely something geological happening," Larry said, studying his instruments again. "The tremors are increasing in frequency. They began at 0.3 hertz this afternoon. Now they are 0.8 hertz. "Is that dangerous?" Janet asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "Probably not," Larry said, but he said it like a man who was not completely sure. "The magnitude remains very small. These are not earthquakes that would cause significant geological events." Patrick fed wood to the fire. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said. "He worked in the deep mines, back when the coal industry still mattered. He said the mountains would sometimes seem to shift. He described it as a feeling more than anything else, like the earth was breathing, like something massive was moving beneath the surface." "That is colorful," Christina said, "but ultimately that is just anxiety caused by enclosed spaces. Miners developed superstitions to cope with the stress." "Probably," Patrick agreed, but he did not sound convinced. I lay in my tent that night and listened to the rumbling. It was definitely growing louder, more insistent, and something else bothered me. Something about the direction it was coming from. It was not constant, not like something far away and static. It was moving, something down in the earth, or perhaps across the hidden landscape beneath the canopy, was moving toward us. I told myself this was irrational thinking. I told myself that I was allowing Patrick's stories and the strangeness of the day to make me paranoid. But the ranger in me, the part that had learned to trust instincts because instincts had saved my life before, was not reassured. The second day began before dawn. I woke to find Catherine already up, sitting by the dying fire with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She looked tired. "Could not sleep?" I asked. "Not much," she admitted. "Something feels wrong. I cannot explain it. My body is telling me that something is not right with this place. I sat down beside her. The rumbling? That too, she said. But it is more than that. This ecosystem is wrong. I have spent 30 years studying wilderness areas, and I have a sense for balance. There is an imbalance here. The animal sounds are wrong. The bird calls started at dawn, but they started too suddenly, as if something had frightened them all at once. And the insects, there are far fewer of them than there should be. I had not consciously noticed any of this, but now that she mentioned it, I realized I had felt it at a subconscious level. The forest around us was too quiet in some fundamental way. It was like listening to a symphony where some of the instruments had gone silent. We did not discuss leaving. That would have been an admission that something was genuinely wrong, and we were all the type of people who had trained ourselves to doubt such instincts. We packed up camp and resumed our hike by 7 in the morning. The landscape had changed overnight. The stream we had been following had grown significantly. It now had the volume and power of a much larger watercourse, even though we had received no rain. The banks showed signs of recent significant flooding, yet the water was clear, not the brown you would expect from storm runoff. "That is impossible," Catherine said, kneeling by the banks. "This volume of water, where is it coming from? There are no springs marked here. No significant tributaries have joined in the last 2 miles. Larry was even more concerned. He was studying the land around us with growing alarm. "The elevation," he said. "According to my maps, we should be at 4,200 feet right now. But according to my altimeter and my GPS unit, we are at 3,900 feet. We have descended 300 feet in 2 miles, but the terrain we traveled was not significantly downhill. Most of our travel was relatively level. I checked my own instruments." He was right. The numbers did not match. I felt the first genuine spike of fear then, the kind that comes when objective reality refuses to align with what you expect. "There is an error in your instruments," Patrick suggested. "Possible," Larry agreed. "But both my GPS and my altimeter would have to be wrong by the same amount, in the same direction. And my maps have been field verified for 30 years. They do not just change." The rumbling sound grew louder that morning, so loud that we could feel it through our boots. It was not random anymore. It had a rhythm to it, a pattern that suggested intention, and it was definitely getting closer. We pushed forward because we did not know what else to do. Turning back meant admitting we were frightened. Continuing forward meant trusting that we would eventually emerge from this wrongness and reach the other side of the valley, where the world would make sense again. We should have turned back. At noon, we came upon the first sign that something else had passed through this forest, and something much larger than a bear. The trees were damaged, but not in any way I had ever seen before. It was not breakage, not exactly. It was more like pressure damage. The bark had been stripped from the lower trunks in massive sections, not gouged or torn but smoothed, as if something enormous had simply rubbed against them with tremendous force. The damage was so extensive that 30 or 40 massive trees had been affected. "What kind of animal does this?" Janet asked. "No animal," Catherine said quietly. "Something much larger, something that moved through here recently. These wounds are fresh. The exposed wood shows no discoloration, no oxidation." "A landslide?" Christina suggested. Could these marks be from a landslide? But even as she said it, we could all see that the pattern was wrong for a landslide. Landslides would destroy trees randomly, would smash and scatter them. This was too organized, too linear. Whatever had moved through here had followed a deliberate path, and that path was pointing directly toward us. We stood there for a long moment, all of us caught in the same realization. We were not lost in a place where something had happened long ago. We were in a place where something was actively, presently wrong. We were in the path of something we did not understand. "We should make for high ground," I said finally. My voice sounded steady, which I was grateful for. "If there is an environmental event, a flood, a geological shift, higher elevation will be safer. We need to climb toward the ridgeline." No one argued. We changed course, abandoning our mapped route, and began pushing upslope, away from the valley floor and the stream that had grown so unnaturally large. But as we climbed, I realized the terrible truth. The rumbling sound was following us. It was not a sound made by something distant. It was a sound made by something that was tracking our movement, pursuing us through the forest, and it was getting closer. The afternoon of that second day became a desperate scramble. We abandoned any pretense of calm, orderly hiking. We climbed the mountainside with the urgency of people who understood that staying in the valley was no longer safe. The rumbling grew louder with every passing hour, so loud now that we could barely hear our own voices. And beneath the sound was something else, a vibration that seemed to pass through the earth itself, a tremor that never stopped, only intensified. Larry was openly panicked now, despite his years of scientific training. "The seismic activity is off the scale," he kept saying, looking at his instruments with something close to horror. "This is not normal. This is not any kind of geological activity I have ever recorded. The frequency, the pattern, the intensity, it is all wrong. It is like the earth itself is moving as a whole, not in the way plates normally move." We pushed upslope for 2 hours, and in that time, I began to see the pattern of the destruction more clearly. The trees that had been stripped of bark marked a path, and that path converged with our current route. Whatever had done this was not behind us anymore. We were walking toward it. I called for a halt when we reached a rocky outcropping at about 5,000 feet. We needed to think, to plan, to make a decision about what to do. We were all exhausted, all breathing hard from the exertion. The temperature at this elevation was noticeably cooler, and clouds had begun to form around the peaks above us. "We need to consider our options," I said, though I had no confidence in any of the options available to us. "We can try to push to the ridgeline and see if there is a trail down the other side. We can attempt to call for rescue, though the satellite phone might not work in this valley. Or we can make camp here and wait to see what happens." "What is it?" Christina demanded. "Eric, what do you think that is? Not what is it supposedly, what do you actually think?" I did not want to answer. I wanted to maintain the fiction that we were dealing with something explicable, something that fit into the natural world I understood. But I was the ranger, and lying to my group was not something I was willing to do. "I think something very large is moving through this valley," I said carefully. "Something that exists in a way that our instruments cannot quite measure accurately. Something that is causing actual environmental changes, the water flow, the elevation changes, the pattern of destruction. I think it is real, and I think it is following us." "Based on what?" Patrick asked. He was trying to be rational, trying to find a scientific explanation. "What evidence do you have?" "The trees mark a path," I said. "The destruction follows a line. That line intersects with our current position and continues in a consistent direction. Whatever is causing this has a route, a direction of travel. We are in the way." The silence that followed was profound. "The old stories," Patrick said finally, looking at me with something like recognition. "The ones my grandfather told. He said the mountains themselves could move. He said there were places in the Appalachians where the earth was not stable, where things could shift." "That is folklore," Catherine said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The problem with folklore," Larry said, "is that it often contains kernels of truth. Generations of people living in an area will notice patterns and develop stories to explain them. What if this valley is a place where something genuinely unusual happens? What if moving mountains is not just a story?" Janet was taking notes frantically, her journalist instincts overriding her fear. "We need to document this," she said. "We need to record what is happening so that people will believe us." But even as she spoke, the rumbling sound intensified to a degree that made us all stagger backward. The ground beneath our feet actually moved, a rolling motion like a wave passing through solid earth. Rocks clattered down the slope above us, dust rose from the ground, and then, for the first time, I heard something else beneath the rumble, a sound like breathing, massive, rhythmic, like the lungs of some enormous creature taking in air. It lasted for perhaps 10 seconds, and then it stopped. When it stopped, the silence was worse than the sound had been. We did not discuss it, we did not debate. We simply gathered our gear and began climbing again. The intelligent part of my mind was screaming that we should not run from something we did not understand, that making for lower ground and trying to find a way out of the valley would be safer than pushing higher into increasingly dangerous terrain. But the part of me that had learned to trust instinct was driving us upward, away from that sound, away from whatever was moving through the valley below us. We climbed for 3 more hours. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western ridgeline. The clouds that had been forming thickened and began to move in our direction. Rain was coming. I could smell it in the air, that distinctive sharp scent that precedes a storm. At around 5 in the evening, we found ourselves on a narrow ridge that separated the valley we had been exploring from another, similar valley on the western side. The view from that ridge was spectacular in a way that made my fear seem suddenly petty. You could see for 50 miles in every direction. The mountains rolled away toward the horizon like waves frozen in stone. But below us, in the valley we had just fled, something extraordinary was happening. The forest canopy was moving. I know that sounds impossible. Forest canopies do not move as unified structures. But what I saw was undeniable. The tops of the trees were swaying, bending, as if being pushed by a massive, invisible hand. And the swaying was not random. It followed a pattern, a line, a direction. It was like watching the impact of a giant hand passing beneath the forest, moving things aside. "There," Christina said, and she pointed directly into the swaying canopy. At first I saw nothing. Then the clouds shifted, and the angle of the late afternoon light changed. And I saw it. It was not a specific shape that I could articulate. It was more the absence of what should have been there. A section of the mountain, perhaps half a mile across and extending down into the valley for nearly a mile, appeared to be raised slightly above the rest of the landscape. The effect was like looking at a map where one region had been slightly lifted off the paper. The forest on top of this raised section was intact but separate, suspended above the surrounding terrain by an amount that might have been 10 feet or might have been 100. It was impossible to judge distances at that scale, and it was moving, not quickly. The movement was slow, measured, like a slab of earth making the transition from one elevation to another. But it was definitely moving. The raised section was descending, which meant that whatever was beneath it, whatever was lifting it, was moving downward. And it was moving in our direction. "That is not possible," Larry whispered. "It is happening," Catherine said. "Whatever skepticism we brought to this place, the evidence is now overwhelming. The mountain itself is moving." We stood there as the sun descended further and the storm clouds grew darker. I knew we needed to make a decision about where to spend the night, and we needed to make it soon. We were exposed on this ridge, vulnerable to the weather that was clearly approaching. But the thought of descending back into the valley, of moving toward that moving section of earth, was intolerable. "There," Patrick said, pointing to a formation of large rocks on the ridge itself. "That might provide shelter. And it is elevated. If water comes, we will not be caught in a flood." We made for the rocks. It was a scramble in the fading light, but we found a space between the large stones that was sheltered and relatively flat. We set up camp there, not a comfortable camp, but adequate. We had enough water from the canteens. We rationed our food. We did not light a fire. None of us wanted to draw attention to our location. As darkness fell, the storm hit. It was not a normal thunderstorm. Normal thunderstorms have a structure, a pattern of intensity. This storm seemed to rage without mercy or rhythm. Lightning cracked across the sky in sheets rather than bolts. Wind gusted with such force that I feared our tents would be ripped away. And the rain. The rain came in waves that seemed less like precipitation and more like the sky itself was trying to wash us away. And beneath it all, louder than ever, was the rumbling. I could not sleep. I lay in my tent and listened to the storm and the rumbling, and I tried to reconcile what I was experiencing with my understanding of how the world worked. I failed. The world was more complex, more dangerous, more fundamentally strange than I had ever allowed myself to believe. Around 2 in the morning, the rumbling changed pitch. It became almost musical, a kind of deep groaning sound that seemed to express something like pain or effort. And then I heard the breathing sound again. That massive inhalation and exhalation that suggested lungs the size of buildings. When the breathing stopped, it was followed by a sound of tremendous impact. Even from our ridge, even with the storm masking some of the sound, I could feel it. Something massive had settled into place. The earth beneath us actually shifted with the impact, and then, gradually, the rumbling began to fade. Dawn brought a silence so complete that it seemed unnatural after the hours of storm and rumbling. We crawled out of our tents to find that the weather had cleared completely. The sky was blue, the air was calm, and the valley below us was transformed. The raised section of earth, the portion of mountainside that had been elevated and moving, was now stable again. But it had not returned to its previous position. It was significantly lower than it had been, a clear depression in the landscape that suggested that whatever had been lifting it had settled into its new position and was now resting. We stood on the ridge and stared at this evidence of something utterly beyond our comprehension. The mountain itself had literally moved. A section of solid earth, supporting acres of forest, had been lifted and then lowered to a new elevation. This was not a psychological phenomenon or a misinterpretation of normal geological events. This was a thing that had actually happened, and we had witnessed it. "We need to document this," Larry said. He was already checking his instruments, taking readings, attempting to capture data that might prove what we had seen. "We need to photograph it, measure it, collect samples. We need evidence." "For what purpose?" Janet asked. "Who would believe this? Who could believe this?" "Scientists would. Larry said firmly. "If we have data, if we have photographs, if we have the testimony of 6 educated witnesses, they would have to believe us. They would have to investigate." But even as he spoke, I was noticing something troubling. The transformation in the valley was not subtle enough to be ignored or explained away, but it also was not dramatic enough to be inexplicable. To someone who had not watched it happen, the depression in the landscape could have been attributed to a massive landslide, to natural geological settling, to any number of accepted phenomena. Our photographic evidence would show a changed landscape, but it would not show the impossible truth of how that change had occurred. We spent the morning documenting and photographing. We took measurements and collected rock and soil samples. We created detailed notes about the timeline of events. We did everything that a scientific expedition would do when confronted with unusual geological phenomena. But I knew, even as we worked, that this evidence would not be enough. We had seen something that did not fit into the accepted framework of how mountains and earth behaved. We had felt it, heard it, witnessed it directly. But we had no way to capture that experience in a form that would convince anyone who had not been here. The descent from the ridge took us in the opposite direction from the valley we had entered. We were attempting to reach the ridgeline trail on the western side of the mountains, a trail that would eventually lead us out of this region and back toward civilization. The hiking was difficult, steep, rocky, with sections where we had to carefully descend using rope, but we did not encounter the rumbling again. Whatever had been moving through those mountains had finished its movement. It had settled into whatever new configuration pleased it, and it had returned to whatever form of rest or existence it normally inhabited. The hike out took us 2 full days. By the evening of July 14th, we emerged onto the familiar ridgeline trail, the one that led to the public access point at the south end of the mountain range. Our satellite phones worked again. We called for a pickup. A vehicle arrived at the trailhead by 9 in the evening. The drive back to the ranger station was surreal. The landscape looked exactly as it always did. The summer sky was full of stars. The radio played popular music and news about ordinary events happening in the ordinary world. For a moment, I could almost convince myself that the previous 3 days had been a shared hallucination, something that happened in our minds rather than in objective reality. But we had the samples. We had the photographs, we had the documentation, and we had the memory of that breathing sound, that impossible sensation of the earth moving beneath our feet. The next day, I submitted my official incident report to the Park Service. I described the unusual earthquake activity. I reported the anomalous water flow and elevation changes. I detailed the tree damage and the section of mountainside that had clearly experienced significant geological disruption. I presented this all in the language of accepted science, in the framework of known geological phenomena. I did not mention the breathing. I did not describe what we had actually experienced. Larry tried to get his data published through academic channels. He submitted papers to geology and geophysics journals, outlining his observations about the unusual seismic activity in that section of the Appalachians. The papers were rejected. The editor said the data was too anomalous, too difficult to reconcile with accepted models of how earthquakes work. One reviewer suggested that his instruments had malfunctioned. Christina's photographs were remarkable, but they showed exactly what a landslide and subsequent geological settling would look like. When she tried to sell them to geographic publications as documentation of unusual natural phenomena, she was told that while they were beautiful, they were not exceptional enough to justify publication. Janet wrote her article about our expedition. She included all the factual details and presented them in a journalistic style. The article was published in a regional outdoor magazine, but it was presented as a story about a group of hikers who had encountered unusual geological activity during a wilderness expedition. It read like adventure narrative rather than documentation of anything genuinely extraordinary. The readers responded positively, but they did not believe that anything impossible had occurred. They were fascinated by the story of the earthquake activity and the adventure of hiking through an active geological region. The deeper truth, if truth is even the correct word for what we experienced, remained hidden. Patrick returned to his quiet life. He did not speak much about the expedition, but occasionally when we would encounter each other at community events, he would mention that his grandfather's stories had begun to make more sense to him. Catherine conducted her own research into the ecological implications of the geological disruption we had witnessed. She noticed that the animal populations in that valley had shifted significantly in the weeks following our expedition. Species were moving, habitats were changing, as if the fundamental nature of that place had been altered. She documented these changes with her usual meticulous attention to detail, but no journal would publish her findings. The evidence did not fit established models of how ecosystems responded to geological events. As for me, I returned to my duties as a ranger. I filed my reports. I guided other hikers. I maintained the trails. But something had changed in me. I had been given a glimpse into a reality that existed beneath the comfortable, explicable world we all inhabited. I had discovered that mountains, these ancient, supposedly permanent structures, were not as stable or as unchanging as we assumed. And I had learned that there were forces operating in the wilderness that we did not understand and could not control. The other rangers began to notice that I avoided that particular section of the Appalachians. When hikers requested to explore Blackfang Valley, I would suggest alternative routes. When someone asked why that area was suddenly considered more difficult or less suitable for expeditions, I would cite the recent geological activity and the resultant hazardous conditions. None of them questioned my recommendation. Ranger intuition is generally respected. 5 months later, in December, I received a letter from Catherine. She had been monitoring reports from the region, tracking the subtle geological and ecological changes that continued to ripple outward from the valley. She had discovered something in the academic literature that made her think of our expedition and the experiences we had shared. There was a paper, published in a geology journal in 1973, by a researcher named Dr. Harold Moffat. The paper discussed a phenomenon that Moffat called mountain migration, the observation that certain mountainous regions, particularly in the older, more stable mountain ranges of North America, seemed to exhibit slow, periodic shifts in their position and elevation. The shifts were minute on the scale of human lifespans, but measurable over decades and centuries. Moffat had theorized that these shifts were caused by slow movements of the Earth's crust in response to deeply buried geological structures, essentially the ground itself breathing, expanding and contracting with changes in pressure and temperature deep beneath the surface. Moffat's paper had been largely dismissed by the scientific community. The data was too subtle, the measurement techniques too imprecise, the implications too strange. But the paper included historical accounts from indigenous peoples in various mountainous regions, accounts that described mountains that moved, that shifted position, that walked across the landscape. What if those accounts were not metaphorical? What if the ancient peoples who inhabited these mountains had genuinely witnessed the same phenomenon that we had observed? What if they had developed stories and mythologies to explain what they did not understand, to give shape and structure to the impossible? The more I considered this possibility, the more sense it made. The old stories were not fantasies, they were documentation, crude and mythologized perhaps, but fundamentally accurate. The moving mountains were real, they had always been real. We simply had the arrogance to assume that something so fundamental to our understanding of the natural world could not change or shift or surprise us. I began to read about Appalachian folklore more carefully. I discovered accounts passed down through generations of mountains that had walked in the night, of valleys that had changed their shape, of the earth itself breathing and moving. The same core elements appeared in stories told by different communities, in different time periods, all pointing toward an underlying truth. And I realized that the expedition to Blackfang Valley had not been chance. Catherine and I had been drawn there specifically to witness something that should have been documented, something that deserved to be understood even if it could not be widely accepted or believed. I was assigned to a different ranger district last year, transferred away from the mountains where I had spent my career. The Park Service said it was a natural rotation, nothing unusual. But I suspected that someone higher up had read my reports, had noticed my reluctance to access certain areas, and had decided that I was no longer suitable for that assignment. Perhaps they were right. I do not trust the mountains the way I once did. I cannot look at them without remembering that breathing sound, that sensation of the earth moving beneath me, like the body of some vast, sleeping creature. I have not tried to convince anyone of what we witnessed. It is pointless. The people who would need to believe do not have the capacity to accept it. The institutions that might investigate lack the will to do so. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some truths are meant to remain on the edge of the known world, acknowledged by those who have experienced them directly, but forever outside the framework of accepted knowledge. But I carry the memory. All 6 of us carry it. We have become bound together by an experience that no one else could possibly understand. We have been changed by what we witnessed in Blackfang Valley, transformed by the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more complex than the comfortable narratives we use to describe it. The mountains of Appalachia are very old. They have witnessed the rise and fall of species, the transformation of climate, the passage of ages, and they are still moving, still shifting, still breathing with a rhythm that operates on a timescale far beyond human perception. I have not returned to Blackfang Valley since that expedition in July. I do not know if I will ever return, but I know that if I did, I would find evidence of further change. The mountains never truly stop moving. They are always shifting, always settling into new configurations, always reshaping the landscape according to forces and patterns that we do not understand. And somewhere, deep beneath the soil and stone, something vast and ancient continues to breathe, waiting for the next time it needs to move, to shift, to walk across the land it has inhabited for longer than human memory can reach. The mountain moved. I witnessed it. And that truth, whether the world accepts it or not, is the most significant thing I have ever experienced in my entire life as a ranger. My name is Daniel Foster. I am a wildlife observer and wilderness guide with 31 years of experience in the Appalachian region. What I am about to tell you happened in late July, during what should have been a routine hiking expedition through Point Pleasant, West Virginia. I still think about that week. Every single day, I think about what we saw out there. The group was assembled by Ronald Simmons, a corporate executive who organized adventure retreats for his company. Ronald was 43 years old, the kind of man who measured his worth through conquest, mountains summited, distances covered, experiences claimed. He had hired me to guide 6 people through a 7-day backcountry trek in the highlands north of Point Pleasant. The money was good. I needed the work. I did not question his motives carefully enough. The team consisted of 6 hikers plus myself. Ronald Simmons led the expedition as the primary organizer. His partner was Brenda Russell, a woman of 57 with a quiet strength that contradicted her nervous laugh. She asked constantly whether the trail was safe, whether bears were present, whether we should turn back. Ronald dismissed her concerns with irritation, as though her caution was a personal failure. Jeffrey Griffin was 66, a retired engineer who said very little. He moved with steady determination, his breathing controlled, his eyes scanning the forest floor with the intensity of someone analyzing a blueprint. Pamela Diaz was 39, athletic and ambitious, always pushing Ronald to schedule the longest distances, to wake earlier, to rest less. Gary Hayes was 74, the oldest among us, a former military man with a posture like a flagpole and hands that trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. Ruth Myers was 61, an artist and botanist who spent hours stopping to examine moss, to sketch wildflowers, to photograph the slope of a valley in different light. Ronald resented her pauses. He wanted to move forward. I accepted the contract and assembled the gear. 5 tents, 7 people total, 8 days in the wilderness, provisions for extended isolation, no cell service at our high camps, no emergency communication except for a satellite phone I kept in my pack. We left Point Pleasant on a Tuesday morning. The weather forecast was favorable, sunny skies, temperatures in the low 70s, nights dropping to the mid-40s, ideal conditions for July backpacking. The first 2 days proceeded without incident. We covered good distance. The group moved well together despite their varied fitness levels. I selected a route that climbed gradually, allowing their bodies to adjust to the elevation and the sustained effort. We slept in a meadow surrounded by dense forest. The stars were brilliant that first night. I remember Brenda sitting outside her tent after dinner, gazing upward, and I remember her saying, "It is so quiet here, quieter than I have ever heard it." I told her that silence was the true gift of the wilderness, that most people never experience genuine silence anymore, that she should enjoy it. I was wrong to frame it that way. Silence in the forest is never empty. Silence is where the forest speaks. On the morning of the 3rd day, everything changed. I woke before dawn, as I always do. I lay in my tent and listened to the forest for signs. Wind speed and direction, animal activity, weather shifts, the quality of birdsong. This is a discipline I maintained for 3 decades. You learn to read the forest through sound. You learn what is normal and what is not. That morning, I heard nothing. I mean that literally. No birdsong, no wind, no insect chorus, no rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. The forest had muted itself. I emerged from my tent and stood in the pre-dawn gray. The air felt thick. Temperature seemed to drop as I stood there. I could see my breath despite the summer season. My instinct told me to investigate, to measure barometric pressure, to check weather systems on the satellite phone. Instead, I did what experience taught me. I waited. I watched. I listened. Brenda emerged from her tent approximately 6 minutes later. She held her sleeping bag around her shoulders against a chill that should not have existed. She looked at me and said, "Something is wrong. Tell me something is not wrong." "The forest is quiet," I said. "No, it is not quiet. It is silent. There is a difference. Silence means something is hiding." I did not respond. She was correct. I felt no need to confirm it aloud. By the time the others emerged, we had begun the morning fire and prepared coffee. Everyone gathered around the flames. Everyone except Jeffrey Griffin. He arrived last, moving with the same deliberate pace he maintained across flat ground or steep incline. He sat and consumed his coffee without comment, but his eyes stayed fixed on the tree line to the northeast. I said we were making good time, that we would reach the high camp by evening if we began immediately after breakfast. Ronald agreed. Pamela wanted to move faster. Ruth asked whether we could spend another hour investigating the rock formations visible on the slope to the east. Ronald said no. We needed to maintain our schedule. We packed and began walking at 7:15 in the morning. The trail that day ran through dense mixed forest. Hemlocks and oak and birch and maple created a canopy so complete that even at midday the light reached us only in scattered patches. The understory was thick with rhododendron. The path was narrow and technical. We moved in single file. Myself at the front, then Ronald, then Pamela, then Ruth, then Jeffrey, then Gary, with Brenda at the rear. After approximately 2 hours, Brenda called forward. Her voice was strange, stretched thin, the kind of voice you use when you are fighting panic. I signaled everyone to stop. "We gathered in a cluster on the trail," Brenda said. "I keep feeling like something is walking beside me. I keep seeing movement in my peripheral vision. Whenever I turn to look, there is nothing there. But I feel it. I absolutely feel it," Pamela said. "It is probably just wildlife. Deer, turkey, the normal things," Brenda said. "I have hiked before. I know what wildlife feels like. This is different." I asked everyone to describe what they had observed. Nothing specific emerged, but everyone had felt something, a sense of presence, a weight to the air, the constant impression of being observed. I explained that this was not uncommon in dense forest during the middle of the day. The light was flat, shadows played tricks. The isolation sometimes made people hyper-aware of small details they would normally ignore. I suggested we continue and that we would reach our camp soon. I was lying. We were only 1/3 of the way through our planned distance. We had 6 more hours of walking minimum. We continued. The feeling intensified. By 1:30 in the afternoon, everyone was silent except for breathing and the sound of boots on the trail. We did not speak. We moved forward with a kind of grim determination that I had never witnessed in this group before. Ronald, who had been talkative and boastful on previous days, said nothing. Pamela, who seemed to feed on her own exertion, moved mechanically. Ruth, who loved the forest and photographed constantly, did not once remove her camera. At 2:15, Jeffrey Griffin stopped abruptly. Everyone behind him stumbled to a halt. He pointed ahead with one arm extended fully. His hand was completely steady. His voice, when he spoke, was flat and professional. "What is that?" We all looked forward on the trail. Approximately 50 meters ahead of us, something had landed on the path. I can describe what I saw. I cannot explain it. I want to be clear about that distinction. The thing was massive. I mean genuinely enormous. Its wingspan, when I first observed it, appeared to measure approximately 6 to 8 meters. It crouched with its back to us. The wings were folded but clearly articulated against its body. The color was a pale gray-brown, the shade of moth wings or dust or something that had been dead for a very long time. The body was humanoid in shape. I mean that it possessed a torso, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but the proportions were entirely wrong. The head was too small for the shoulders. The arms were too long, the fingers extended nearly as far as the knees when the thing stood upright, and it was definitely standing upright. It turned toward us slowly, with a deliberate motion like the turning of a crane or a construction mechanism. Its head rotated first, then the shoulders, then the body followed. The face I cannot describe adequately. Imagine human features rendered in leather and shadow, a face where the eyes are too large and too empty, where the mouth is a thin line that seems not to function correctly. A face that should not exist on any living creature. I remember Gary Hayes stepping backward. I remember his foot slipping on the loose stone of the trail. I remember him falling to one knee. I remember making a sound that was not quite a word. The creature did something with its wings. They unfurled like two enormous hands, opening suddenly. The motion displaced air enough that I felt the wind reach me even at that distance. The feathers, if they were feathers, seemed to catch the fragmented light in ways that made my vision blur. It did not attack. It did not move toward us. It simply stood there with its wings spread and looked at us. No one moved. No one made any sound except our breathing. The creature folded its wings. It performed a kind of crouch, and then it launched upward. The movement was wrong. Nothing that massive should move that quickly or that fluidly. It rose through the canopy and disappeared into the green shadow of the uppermost leaves. We heard the flutter of its passage. We heard the rush of air. We heard branches splitting under something enormous passing through them. Then silence. The forest silence. The kind of silence that means something is hiding. Ruth said, "What was that?" No one answered. Brenda said, "We need to leave. We need to leave right now." Ronald said, "We will continue to the camp." Brenda said, "Did you see that thing? Did you understand what you just saw?" Ronald said, "We have paid for this expedition. We will complete this expedition. We will continue now." Jeffrey said, "I need to note what we observed in the record. Can anyone describe what we saw with precision?" Gary said, "I need to sit down. I need a moment to sit down." I said, "Everyone stay together. Stay close on the trail. Do not separate. We will reach the camp and we will discuss this." I did not know what we had seen. I still do not know, but I knew something had changed. The forest had shown us something, and the forest did not do that lightly. We moved forward at a faster pace. No one spoke. The rest of the afternoon passed in a kind of focused march. We heard sounds in the canopy above us, rustling, movement. Once I heard what sounded like a shriek or a cry from somewhere to the north. It was not a bird sound. It was not any animal sound I could identify. At 5:30 we reached the high camp. We assembled the tents in a tight cluster. We built the fire large and bright. No one wanted to be separated. No one wanted the darkness to be deep. That night, after the others attempted sleep, I sat alone by the fire with the satellite phone in my hand. I considered calling for emergency extraction. I considered several lies I could tell. Then I considered the probable response, a rescue team making a difficult ascent through forest in darkness. Questions I could not answer. Explanations I could not provide. What would I say? That we saw a large animal? That we saw something unusual? That we were frightened? The creature was still out there. If it meant us harm, it had already had opportunity. It had chosen not to take it. That restraint was somehow more terrifying than aggression would have been. I did not call for help. I sat by the fire until dawn, and I watched the forest beyond the light, and I waited to see what the next day would bring. Dawn came gray and cold. Everyone emerged from their tents looking worse than they had the day before. Sleep had not healed anything. Brenda had dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. Ruth sat silently without eating. Gary's hands shook more than before. Jeffrey documented everything in a small leather notebook, sketching what he remembered of the creature and noting the exact time and coordinates. Ronald insisted we continue the expedition. His reasoning was financial. We had paid in advance. The group dynamics had already shifted to accommodate the loss of 2 days. We needed to maintain schedule. Pamela argued with him quietly over breakfast. She said we should turn back. She said no money was worth this risk. But Ronald said that risk was always part of mountaineering. That fear was a threshold you crossed. That pushing beyond fear was the only way to grow. Pamela accepted this. She always did. She wanted Ronald to accept her. His words mattered to her, so she said, "If you are going forward, I will go." Jeffrey said, "I want to continue to the northeast summit." The creature was heading that direction when it flew. "I believe we should document its territory and behavior," I said. "We will turn south. We will revise the route away from the northeast ridge and toward the lower elevations," Ronald said. "We hired you to guide us through the wilderness. We are paying you. We will continue on the original route." Brenda said, "The original route is north. North is where we saw that thing." Ronald said, "Exactly. Whatever that creature is, it is solitary and territorial. We are moving through its habitat. As long as we do not provoke it, it will likely leave us alone. Once we pass through its territory, we continue on with our expedition." I disagreed. Every instinct told me that entering that creature's territory deliberately was a serious mistake. But Ronald controlled the group dynamics. He had money invested, he had reputation invested. He was not going to turn back. So I revised the route slightly. We would head northwest rather than north, putting us on a vector that would take us around the creature's apparent position rather than directly through it. It was a compromise that satisfied Ronald and addressed at least some of the group's fear. We broke camp and moved out at 7:30. The forest seemed different that morning. The color had drained from it. The greens looked more like browns. The light seemed to come from below ground rather than above. I attributed this to weather, but I was not certain. My instruments said the conditions had not changed. My senses said everything had transformed. We walked for 3 hours without incident. The trail was easier than the previous day. The terrain began to open up as we descended gradually. By 10:30, we could see sky through the canopy. We could smell the change in air quality. We were approaching the edge of the dense forest zone. This should have felt like success. It felt like danger. I called a rest stop at a small stream. Everyone collapsed gratefully. Feet were blistered. Legs were sore. Everyone was exhausted from the anxiety as much as from the physical exertion. Ruth finally spoke while she soaked her feet in the cold water. She said, "I heard it again, this morning, while we were walking." No one responded. We all knew what she meant, Gary said. "I heard it too, something moving parallel to us, keeping pace. I heard it for about 20 minutes before it stopped." Brenda said, "It is hurting us. It is trying to move us in a specific direction," Jeffrey said. "That suggests a level of intelligence consistent with predatory behavior, a creature attempting to manipulate prey positioning," Ronald said. "Or it is simply following the same general direction we are traveling. Coincidence is more logical than conspiracy," Ruth said. "It is not coincidence. The thing is watching us. It has been watching us since we saw it yesterday. I feel it constantly now." I said nothing. My job was to keep the group moving and intact. My job was not to interpret signs that should not exist. My job was to convince them that the wilderness was manageable and that I could protect them. I was failing all of these objectives. We continued. The forest began to thin as we approached the foothills. The canopy opened. Light reached us fully. This should have brought relief. It did not. At 1:15, Jeffrey stopped and gestured to the slope to our east. Approximately 300 meters up the hillside, something moved between the trees. It was dark and massive and moving fast, not on the ground, through the air. The thing flew in a low arc and disappeared behind the ridge, Pamela said. "It is hunting something, or it was showing us it is nearby. One of those two things," Ronald said. "Or it was a large bird, or a trick of light and shadow," Jeffrey said. "That was no bird. The flight pattern was wrong. The body shape was wrong. That was the same creature." We did not stop. We increased our pace. By 3 o'clock, we had descended to the foothills. We were approaching the area where we would establish our final camp before turning back toward Point Pleasant. The landscape had changed. We were moving through a more open forest with stands of older growth trees and clearings where deer grazed in the filtered light. This is when things accelerated toward their conclusion. Brenda was walking third in our line, behind Ronald and Pamela. She was distracted, looking at something behind us. She was not watching the path. She walked directly into a tripwire that had been constructed between two saplings at shin height. A tripwire meant nothing naturally occurring could have made. A tripwire constructed deliberately by something that understood physics and causality. Brenda fell forward. Her momentum carried her down a small embankment. She tumbled through ferns and moss and loose stone and came to rest against a fallen log approximately 8 meters down the slope. She was hurt. We could hear her cry out. We could see blood on her leg and on her arm. We scrambled down to her. Gary was struggling with the descent despite his military training. Ruth was calling out concern. Jeffrey was filming everything on a small camera he had concealed in his pack. Ronald was moving with purpose, assuming command, removing the first aid kit. Brenda's leg was wounded. The skin was split open and bleeding freely. Her left arm had a deep gash along the forearm, but she was conscious and able to move. The injuries were serious but not catastrophic. Ronald applied pressure to the wounds. I checked her for additional injuries. Ruth was trying to calm her. Gary stood upslope, watching the forest above us. Jeffrey continued documenting. This is when I heard the sound from above. It was not a shriek. It was not an animal vocalization. It was a sound like wind passing through enormous horn. A sound like breath from something inhuman. I looked up toward the ridge where we had been walking moments before. The creature stood on the trail where Brenda had fallen. It stood perfectly upright. Its wings were partially unfolded, creating a silhouette against the sky that burned itself permanently into my memory. Its head was tilted at an angle of perhaps 30 degrees, as though it was examining something of great interest. It was examining us, I said. Everyone move, down the embankment, now. No one questioned me. Survival instinct overrides everything else in a moment like that. We moved downslope as fast as we could while supporting Brenda. The creature made no sound. It did not move toward us. It simply stood there and watched us retreat. We descended into a ravine. The terrain became more rugged. The forest pressed in closer. We moved parallel to a small creek bed, heading generally south and downslope. No one spoke. No one looked back. We moved like that for nearly 2 hours. The light was beginning to fail by the time I felt safe enough to stop. We found a small shelter, an overhang of rock with a dry space large enough for all of us. We established an emergency camp. I used supplies from my pack to create a more complete first aid treatment for Brenda's leg. The cuts were deep but not requiring stitches. I cleaned them, applied antibiotic, bandaged them carefully. Brenda was in shock, quietly panicking. She kept saying, "That was not an animal. That was not a normal animal." Ronald sat outside the overhang, keeping watch. Jeffrey reviewed his camera footage. Gary dozed fitfully. Ruth held Brenda's good hand and said nothing. I said, "We will rest here tonight. Tomorrow morning we will head directly toward Point Pleasant. We will exit the forest on the main road. This expedition is concluded." No one argued. Ronald had accepted defeat. The wilderness had defeated him. The creature had defeated him. Money and will and ambition could not overcome something that operated by rules that we did not understand. That night, I kept watch in shifts with Ronald. We sat outside the overhang in the darkness. We did not speak much, but at one point he said, "That thing was hurting us. You knew it was hurting us." I said, "Yes," he said. "Why? Why would it do that?" I said, "Because Brenda fell, because it wanted us to go toward her, because something very bad would have happened if we had not gone down that embankment when we did." Ronald said, "What was up there?" I said, "I do not know, but I am grateful we did not find out." We sat in silence for the rest of the night. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath. The creature did not approach, but I felt it watching from somewhere in the darkness beyond our small circle of safety. We emerged from the forest at 11:30 the following morning. We stumbled onto a logging road that connected to a rural highway. A driver found us approximately 20 minutes later. She called emergency services. By 1 o'clock, we were in Point Pleasant Memorial Hospital, receiving medical evaluation. Brenda required 12 stitches. The wounds had not been deep enough for surgery, but the infections that could result needed careful monitoring. Gary was treated for dehydration and exhaustion. Ruth was examined and released. Jeffrey refused all treatment. Ronald requested to leave against medical advice. I was the last to be examined. The physician asked me standard questions: injuries, exposure, disorientation. I answered everything honestly. She asked whether we had encountered any animals that had attacked us. I said yes, but that we had escaped before serious injury occurred. She asked what kind of animal it was. I said, "I do not know." She said, "Can you describe it?" I said, "No, not in a way that would be credible. Not in a way that anyone would believe." She looked at me with concern and asked whether I was experiencing any hallucinations or psychiatric symptoms. I told her I was not. I told her that what we had encountered was real and that all 6 members of our group would verify it. That was 4 days ago. Here is what has happened since. Brenda agreed to speak with authorities about the incident. She described the creature as an enormous moth-like being with humanoid features. She said it appeared to hunt intelligently. She said she believed it had deliberately injured her as a method of controlling the group's behavior. The police interviewed us extensively. They found no evidence of an unknown creature in the Point Pleasant area. They suggested we had experienced shared delusional symptoms brought on by stress and isolation. They closed their investigation after 6 days. Jeffrey released his camera footage to several cryptozoological research organizations. The footage is grainy and shot at extreme distance, but it shows something. The footage shows a large creature in flight. The footage shows something that should not exist in the Appalachian wilderness. The organizations that received it are divided on authenticity. Most believe it is a hoax or misidentification. Some claim it represents genuine evidence of an undocumented species. Ronald returned to his corporate position. He gave no statements to the media. He did not discuss the expedition publicly. He has not responded to my attempts at contact. Pamela filed a lawsuit against the expedition company for failure to provide adequate safety precautions. The case has not yet been resolved. She insisted in her deposition that we encountered an unknown predator species. She contradicted Ronald's assertion that we had experienced mass hysteria. She demanded that the wilderness area be studied for evidence of the creature's presence. Her lawsuit was dismissed on grounds of insufficient evidence. She appealed. Ruth returned to her life as an artist and botanist. She continued her sketching. She has created a series of paintings depicting the creature. The paintings are anatomically precise, based on observations made during our encounter. The paintings are also deeply disturbing. They have been featured in several galleries. She has given interviews describing the creature as both powerful and intelligent, as something that was not necessarily evil, but was operating by a logic that humans could not follow. Gary has not spoken publicly. I spoke with him by telephone 2 weeks after the incident. He said, "That thing was testing us. It was learning from us. It will come back." I asked him why he thought that. He said, "Because it was curious, because we were something unusual in its world. Because it will want to know more about us." I have not contacted him since. I have thought extensively about what we encountered. I have reviewed everything I know about cryptozoological encounters, about creature behavior, about predator methodology. The thing we saw matched descriptions of a creature known as the Mothman. Historical reports place it in Point Pleasant during 1966 and 1967. Hundreds of people reported encounters. Most were vague, some were specific. All were dismissed or explained away or forgotten. I believe what we encountered was real. I believe it was intelligent. I believe it was observing us carefully and making decisions about whether we represented a threat or an opportunity. I believe that by tumbling down that embankment, Brenda may have saved our lives. I believe the creature used her injury to move us away from something. I believe it was protecting us from something worse. I believe this because the alternative is that nothing in the world is safe, that the wilderness contains intelligences that are watching us, that they are learning our patterns and our vulnerabilities, that they are patient and methodical, and that they will eventually move against us when they have learned enough. That alternative is worse than any monster. So I have come to speak with you about what happened. I have come to tell you that the wilderness is not a place of simple dangers. It is not a place where careful planning and experience will keep you safe. The wilderness contains things that we do not understand, things that operate by rules that we have not discovered, things that are interested in us in ways that we cannot predict. If you go into the forest, into the mountains, into the wild places of this world, you are entering the territory of something else. You are entering territory that was never yours to explore. You are entering a world where the rules are not written in language that you speak. You need to understand this before you pack your gear and venture into the hills. You need to understand that you are not welcome there. And if you encounter something that seems impossible, that seems beyond explanation, something that your mind initially refuses to accept as real, you need to listen to every instinct that tells you to leave, because survival in the wilderness depends on understanding the rules, and the rules are not the ones written in the guidebooks. The rules are written by something very old and something very patient. The rules are written in the language of things that have been watching from the trees far longer than we have been walking beneath them. This is my testimony. This is what I witnessed. This is what 4 other people witnessed alongside me. Believe it or do not, but know that the creature is still out there. It is still in Point Pleasant. It is still in the mountains and valleys surrounding that town. It is still learning. It is still watching. And someday, perhaps, when you are alone in the forest, you will feel it observing you. You will hear its breath on the wind. You will see its wings against the fading light. And you will understand that I have been truthful. You will understand that some places do not belong to us. My name is Ryan Ford. I am 35 years old, and I work as a park ranger in the Appalachian Mountains. I have been walking these trails for nearly 12 years now, and I thought I had seen everything this wilderness could throw at me. I was wrong. It started in late August when a group of 6 of us decided to take a week-long hiking trip into the remote regions of the mountains. I should say that none of us were strangers. We had all grown up in the surrounding towns and valleys. 5 of the hikers were personal friends and acquaintances. The 6th person was someone I had invited almost as an afterthought. Let me introduce them to you properly. Cheryl Hamilton was 52 years old. She was a woman of middle height with graying hair that she always wore tied back in a practical braid. She worked as a librarian in the nearest town, and she had an encyclopedic knowledge of local history. She was quiet, observant, and rarely spoke unless she had something meaningful to contribute to a conversation. I had known Cheryl since high school. She was reliable and steady, the kind of person you wanted around during difficult circumstances. Jacob Graham was 68. He was the oldest among us. Jacob had lived his entire life in a small cabin near the edge of the national park. He was a former hunter and trapper, now retired but still maintaining the skills that had defined his youth. His face was weathered like the bark of an old oak tree. His hands were large and capable. He moved with the confidence of a man who had spent more time in the wilderness than in civilization. Anna Sullivan was 41. She was a wildlife photographer who had moved back to her hometown after years working in various national parks across the country. She was athletic, optimistic, and always ready with a joke or an encouragement when morale sagged. She carried an expensive camera with her everywhere she went, even on this trip. She said she wanted to document the forests at the height of summer. Nicholas Wallace was 58. He was a retired electrician with a quiet demeanor and a tendency toward nervousness. He had been my neighbor for 10 years, and while we were not close friends, we were friendly enough. He had recently lost his wife, and I think this trip was his way of getting out of the house and trying to reconnect with life. His hands shook sometimes, particularly when he was tired. I had invited him partly out of pity. Joyce Woods was 77 years old. She was Cheryl's grandmother, though she looked younger than her years. Joyce had grown up in the mountains, the daughter of a woman who had allegedly been a midwife with knowledge of folk remedies and old practices. Joyce herself was something of a living archive of Appalachian folklore and superstition. She had a habit of speaking in warnings and telling old stories. She could be cryptic. She wore long skirts even when hiking, and she moved carefully through the forest as if listening to something the rest of us could not hear. The 6 of us had gathered at the trailhead parking lot on a Friday morning in late August. The weather was beautiful. The sky was clear and pale blue. The temperature was mild. It was the kind of day that made you forget that summer was ending, that autumn would eventually come with its shortening days and biting cold. We had planned a 7-day hiking trip through the Appalachian Mountains. Our route would take us through dense forest, across high ridges, and through several remote valleys where the mountains seemed to press down from all sides. We would camp at established sites, though some of them were rarely used and received few visitors. This was deliberate. We wanted solitude. We wanted to experience something authentic and undisturbed. I should have questioned Joyce's presence more carefully. Looking back, I should have asked why she had insisted on coming. She was 77 years old. The hike was strenuous. It would take us far from any road, any building, any sign of civilization. But when she had mentioned to Cheryl that she wanted to come, and when Cheryl had asked if we would mind having her along, none of us had objected. We had all assured her that it was fine, that we would slow our pace to accommodate her. We had been foolish and careless. As I stood at the trailhead that morning, checking my pack one final time, Jacob came to stand beside me. He was looking up at the mountains, at the way the forest climbed upward toward the ridgeline above us. His expression was unreadable. "You feel it?" he asked me. "Feel what?" I said, though I was already suspicious. Jacob did not ask idle questions. "There is something different about these mountains this year," he said. "Something that is not right. I have spent 68 years in this wilderness, and I know what it should feel like. It does not feel like that now." I told him that I had not noticed anything unusual. I told him that the mountains seemed normal to me, that the weather was good, that the trails were clear. Jacob did not respond to this. He simply nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he had already suspected. The 6 of us began walking at 10 o'clock in the morning. The trail took us through a mixed forest of oak and hickory and hemlock. The canopy above was thick but not impenetrable. Patches of golden light fell through the leaves in scattered places. The ground beneath our feet was soft with decades of accumulated leaf litter. Everything smelled green and ancient and alive. We walked for 6 hours that first day without stopping for a substantial break. We covered approximately 14 miles. By late afternoon, we reached our first campsite, a small cleared area near a stream that was marked on our map. The site showed evidence of occasional use. There was a fire ring that had been built in the proper way, with rocks arranged in a circle. There were a few stumps that had been cut level for sitting. A wire was strung between 2 trees for hanging food packs. Anna was the first to comment on how pristine the site was. "It is beautiful," she said, already pulling out her camera to photograph the light filtering through the trees. "How often do people come here?" "Not often," I said, This is one of the more remote sites in this section of the park. Most hikers stick to the major trails and the campgrounds that are marked on the official maps. Jacob was standing at the edge of the campsite, looking out into the forest. Cheryl had noticed his posture and came to stand near him. Joyce was sitting on one of the stumps, removing her hiking boots carefully. Nicholas was helping Anna with her pack. "There are no animal signs," Jacob said to me, quietly enough that the others could not hear him. "No deer, no raccoons, no birds, nothing. The forest is empty." I listened carefully. He was right. In all my years working as a park ranger, I had become accustomed to the sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the distant scurry of small animals in the undergrowth, the movements of larger creatures crashing through the brush when they heard us coming. But here, at this campsite, there was only silence. The silence was not peaceful. It felt like a held breath. It felt like waiting. "Animals avoid areas for various reasons," I said. I was trying to reassure myself as much as I was trying to reassure Jacob. It could be a seasonal thing. It could be related to food sources. Jacob did not respond. He simply turned away and began gathering wood for our evening fire. We made camp as the sun began to descend toward the western ridge. We set up our tents in a careful circle around the fire pit. We cooked a simple dinner of dehydrated food that we had packed in. We ate and talked about the distance we had covered, about the weather forecast for the next day, about the routes we would take. No one mentioned the absence of wildlife or the profound stillness of the forest. As darkness fell completely, the fire became our world. The light from the flames illuminated the faces of my companions, but beyond the circle of that light, the forest was absolute blackness. It was the kind of darkness that makes you feel small and insignificant. It was the kind of darkness that suggests that many things could be watching you from just beyond the reach of your vision. Joyce was the one who brought up the old stories. "My grandmother used to say that the mountains belonged to more than just the animals," she said. "She said that there were things that lived here that were not supposed to be bothered. Things that did not like intrusion." "Superstition," Nicholas said, though his voice was uncertain. "Perhaps," Joyce replied. "Or perhaps wisdom that my family had learned through trial and error. My grandmother was a midwife, you see. She knew the mountains in a way that very few people do. She would go into places to help women give birth that were far from any town or doctor. She saw things in the deep forests. She encountered things." "What sort of things?" Anna asked. She was genuinely interested, leaning forward toward the fire. "The Wampus Cat," Joyce said. "It is an old story. It goes back before our people came to these mountains. My grandmother said it was an ancient thing, a creature that was bound to this place by a curse that was older than any of us. She said that it was dangerous, and that certain actions would draw its attention, certain kinds of intrusion into places where it did not want to be found." Cheryl, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up. "I have read about that," she said. "The legend is recorded in some of the oldest folk archives. The Wampus Cat is described as a creature that is part woman, part mountain cat, and part something else. Something that is difficult to describe in words. It is said to be bound to these mountains, and it is said to hunt those who violate certain unspoken rules." "What rules?" Nicholas asked. "That is where the stories become unclear," Joyce said. "My grandmother was not entirely forthcoming with the details. She said that there were places in the mountains where one should not go. She said that there were times when the forest was more dangerous than others. She said that certain types of people attracted the creature's attention more readily than others." I should have taken this conversation more seriously. I should have recognized it as a warning. But I was younger then, or at least more dismissive of folklore and superstition. I believed in facts and evidence. I believed in the world as it could be measured and tested. I told the group that old stories were interesting from a cultural perspective, but that they were not literally true. "There is no evidence that such a creature exists," I said. "The mountains are not inhabited by cryptids or monsters. They are inhabited by animals that follow predictable patterns of behavior. What we find when we spend time in wild places is usually our own fears, magnified by isolation and darkness and the power of suggestion." Jacob looked at me across the fire, and in his weathered face I saw something like pity. "The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence," he said. "I have spent my entire life in these mountains. I have learned to respect them. I have learned that there are places and things that are better left undisturbed." The conversation died away after that. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire. Eventually, one by one, my companions excused themselves and went to their tents. I stayed by the fire for a while longer, stirring the embers with a stick and thinking about the things that Joyce had said, about the old stories and the old fears. I finally made my way to my own tent sometime after midnight. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the night. But there were so few sounds. Mostly there was just the wind in the trees and the distant sound of the stream. No animals calling, no birds singing, no life stirring in the darkness. I fell asleep thinking about that silence. I dreamed of forests where nothing moved and nothing breathed. The second day of our hike took us deeper into the mountains. We left the relatively well-maintained trail that connected the established campsite and began following a series of old paths that were barely marked on modern maps. These were the kinds of trails that had been made by repeated use over decades, but not recently. Grass and small saplings were beginning to reclaim them. In some places, we had to move carefully to avoid losing the path entirely. The weather remained clear and mild. Anna was in excellent spirits, stopping frequently to photograph wildflowers and interesting rock formations. Cheryl was walking steadily, her pack fitting neatly on her shoulders. Nicholas was keeping pace without difficulty, though I noticed his hands were trembling more than usual as he adjusted his pack straps during our midday break. Jacob and Joyce were walking together, maintaining a steady pace near the middle of the group. I was at the front, setting the route and watching for hazards. Every so often I would look back to make sure everyone was keeping up. It was during one of these looks back that I first noticed something unusual. The forest behind us was completely empty. When you are hiking in a group, you become accustomed to hearing the sound of feet on the path, the rustling of packs, the murmur of voices. But that is only when there is a group immediately behind you. What struck me as odd was the emptiness further back, at distances of 100 yards or more. Typically in a forest like this, there would be ambient animal activity. You would hear the sound of larger creatures moving away from the trail as your group approached. You would hear birds reacting to your presence. You would sense the movement of life around you, but there was nothing. The silence was so complete that it seemed almost to have a physical quality. It was as if we were walking through a forest that had been evacuated, as if everything that lived there had been warned of our approach and had fled. I mentioned this to Jacob during our afternoon break. We were sitting on a fallen log while the others rested and ate their lunch. Jacob seemed unsurprised. "I have been watching for this," he said. "It started yesterday evening. The absence. It is spreading." "Spreading from where?" I asked. "From ahead," Jacob said. "From the direction we are traveling. Something does not want us going that way." I wanted to dismiss his observation. I wanted to tell him that animals often avoid humans, that there was nothing unusual about the silence. But the truth was that in 12 years of park ranger work, I had never experienced anything quite like this. The forests I knew were alive. They were full of sound and movement, and the complex interactions of 1,000 different species. This forest felt dead, or more accurately, it felt abandoned. That evening we camped in a valley that was surrounded by steep ridges on 3 sides. The valley floor was relatively flat, covered in a thick growth of grass and the remnants of what appeared to be an old cultivation. Cheryl informed us that based on the maps she had studied, this area had been settled in the 1800s. A family or small community had lived here once, clearing the forest to make room for farming. But that was long ago. The forest had reclaimed most of the land. The only evidence of human habitation was the strange flatness of the ground and the occasional sight of what might have been an old fence line overgrown with vegetation. "Why would they have abandoned this place?" Nicholas asked. "It seems like a good location. Relatively flat, access to water from the stream, good soil. Perhaps they simply moved on," Anna suggested, "as settlements do, new opportunities elsewhere, the tide of civilization moving in different directions." But Joyce was shaking her head slowly. "My grandmother told me about a place like this," she said. "A valley where people had tried to settle and farm. She said that something drove them away, something that did not want them there. They lasted for a generation or two, and then they left. And they did not come back." "Do you know which valley this is?" Cheryl asked, with genuine interest. "If you can identify it specifically, I may be able to find historical records that confirm what your grandmother told you." Joyce looked around the valley, at the ridges that closed in around us, at the way the evening light was beginning to turn the sky a deep orange. "I do not know if it is the same place," she said, "but the feeling is similar. My grandmother said that in places where something does not want you, you feel it in your bones. You feel it in the way the forest watches you." I was beginning to feel uncomfortable. The conversation was drifting into territory that seemed increasingly uncomfortable and increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere folklore. I suggested that we focus on setting up camp and preparing dinner, rather than speculating about historical mysteries. That night, as we sat around the fire, Anna asked to show us some of the photographs she had taken during the day. She pulled out her camera and began scrolling through the images. They were excellent photographs. She had captured the light moving through the forest in beautiful ways. She had photographed wildflowers and rock formations and a few distant landscape shots from the ridges. But as we looked through the images, something became apparent. In nearly every photograph, there was a section of the forest that appeared unusual. It was subtle at first glance, but once you noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. In the background of many of the images, there appeared to be a section where the trees seemed to be arranged differently, where the darkness seemed somehow deeper and more absolute, where something seemed to be watching the camera. "That is probably just a shadow," Nicholas said, though his voice wavered. "Shadows do not have that shape," Cheryl said quietly. "Look at the progression through the photographs. Whatever that is, it seems to be moving. It seems to be following us." Anna was looking at her images with growing concern. She had taken many more photographs than she had shown us, and as we scrolled through them, the pattern became clearer. In the earlier photographs from the morning, the strange darkness in the background was subtle, almost invisible. But in the photographs from the afternoon, it was more pronounced. And in the final photographs that she had taken just before we stopped for the day, it was unmistakably present. A section of darkness and shadow, moving parallel to our path, keeping a distance of perhaps 100 yards. "It could be another hiker," Anna said. "Someone else on the trail. Someone following our route." But we had not seen anyone. We had not heard anyone. And the formation of that darkness, the way it seemed to have an organic quality, did not look like a human being. It looked like something large, something that was composed of shadow itself. Jacob was examining the photographs with particular intensity. He pointed to one image where the darkness in the background seemed to have taken on a more defined shape. You could almost see an outline. You could almost see the shape of a head and shoulders, though the features were too obscured by shadow to make out any details. "That is why the animals have fled," Jacob said. "That is why the forest is empty. It is here. It is here with us." I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to explain that photographs could be deceiving, that shadows could create illusions, that our minds were primed to see patterns and shapes even where none existed. But the fear was beginning to grow in my chest. A cold, spreading fear that started in my stomach and seemed to creep outward through my limbs. "We should go back," Nicholas said. His voice was shaking. "We should leave tonight. We should hike back to the main trail and leave the mountains entirely." "It is too dark to hike safely," I said. "We can barely see 10 feet in front of us. If we try to make the descent in darkness, someone will be injured." "Then at least let us leave first thing in the morning," Anna said. "Let us cut the trip short and get out of here." I agreed that we would leave early in the morning. I told the group that we would hike back to the main trail and make our way out of the mountains. I made this decision quickly, before anyone could disagree or question my judgment. In my experience as a park ranger, safety was paramount, and whatever was happening, whatever was following us, I did not think we should stay in the mountains to investigate it further. We did not sleep well that night. I lay in my tent listening to the silence outside. No wind, no animals, no sound at all, except for the soft sound of the stream and the occasional creak of the tent fabric in some breeze too slight for me to feel. I thought about the photographs and the way that darkness seemed to have moved through each successive image. I thought about the stories that Joyce had told us about the Wampus Cat and the things that lived in the deep forests. I thought about what it meant that the animals had fled. Animals flee from danger. They sense threats that humans often cannot perceive. The fact that the forest was empty meant that something was wrong. Something was very wrong. At some point during the night, I heard a sound. It came from the direction of the ridge that rose above our campsite. It was not a loud sound. It was a low, rolling sound, like a rumble of distant thunder. But the sky was clear. There was no storm. The sound continued for several seconds and then faded away. In the morning, I did not mention the sound to the others, and none of them mentioned it to me. But I had the sense that they had all heard it, that they had all lain awake in their tents, listening to that impossible sound, and had decided not to speak of it. We broke camp at dawn. We ate a quick breakfast and packed our tents with an urgency that none of us had felt the previous days. We were moving like people who were running from something, though we were all careful not to say that explicitly. We moved quickly but without panic. We maintained our formations and kept watch for hazards on the trail. The descent toward the main trail took us most of the day. By the time we reached the well-maintained path that would take us back toward the trailhead parking lot, it was late afternoon. We were all exhausted. We had covered more than 20 miles, pushing ourselves hard to get down from the remote valleys and back to civilization. We made camp that night at an established site that was only about 5 miles from the parking lot. It was a site that received regular use from hikers and backpackers. There were clear signs of recent visitors. The ground was packed down hard from repeated use. There was a large log cabin nearby that served as a shelter for those who did not want to carry tents. That night, for the first time since we had begun the hike, I felt something like safety. We were close to the trailhead, we were close to the road, we were close to my truck and to the nearby town. Whatever had been following us in those remote valleys seemed less threatening now that we were among the more traveled parts of the mountain. Whatever had been in those photographs could not reach us here. We packed up early the next morning and covered the final 5 miles without incident. We reached the parking lot around midday. My truck was where I had left it. The parking lot contained several other vehicles belonging to day hikers. Everything seemed normal, ordinary. The real world seemed to be continuing exactly as it should, unaware of what we had experienced in the mountains. But as we loaded our packs into my truck, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. Cheryl was standing at the edge of the parking lot, looking back toward the mountain. Following her gaze, I could see the forest at the edge of the trees. There, barely visible in the shadow of the forest, was a shape, a large shape, watching us, moving slightly, as if restless. I had only a moment to see it. Then Jacob had stepped in front of me, blocking my view. He was looking at me directly, his weathered face grave. "Do not look at it," he said quietly. "Do not acknowledge it. We need to leave immediately." I got everyone into the truck. I started the engine and began driving down the mountain road without waiting for anyone to suggest it. No one spoke. No one looked back. We simply drove in silence until we reached the small town at the foot of the mountains. I dropped off my companions at their homes one by one. By the time I was back at my own house, the sun was setting. I stood in my kitchen, making coffee and trying to process what we had experienced. It seemed increasingly unreal now that I was surrounded by the trappings of civilization. The electricity, the running water, the sounds of the town outside my window. The mountain seemed like a distant dream, something that had happened to someone else. But 3 days later, something happened that confirmed that our experience had been terrifyingly real. I was at my post as a park ranger when Nicholas Wallace came to find me. He looked terrible. He had clearly not been sleeping well. His clothes were rumpled, his hands were shaking worse than ever. "I have been experiencing something," he said, "since we came back from the mountains. Things I cannot explain. I wanted to talk to you because you are the ranger. I thought you might have some explanation." I invited him into my office and closed the door. Nicholas sat down heavily in a chair. "It started the night after we got back," he said. "I was lying in bed in my house and I kept hearing something, scratching sounds at my windows. All 4 of them, like something with claws was trying to get in. I got up and looked, but there was nothing there. No animal, no tree branches. Just the darkness outside. The scratching would start, and I would go to look, and when I got to the window, it would stop." He paused, and I could see him struggling to continue. "But it has been getting worse," he said. "Now it is not just scratching. Now I see things, at the edges of my property. Shapes that move when I am not looking directly at them. Things that vanish when I try to focus on them. And the sounds have changed. It is not just scratching anymore. It is sounds like voices, like something is trying to speak to me." I asked him if he had considered that this might be stress-related, that our experience in the mountains, combined with grief from the loss of his wife, might be affecting his perception of reality. "I am not crazy," he said flatly. "I know what I am experiencing is real, and I think you know it too. I think we all know it. That thing that was following us in the mountains, that darkness in Anna's photographs, it did not stay in the mountains. It came back with us. It is here now. It is attached to us somehow. To me specifically, for some reason." Over the following weeks, I learned that Nicholas was not the only one experiencing unusual phenomena. Anna reported that her camera had stopped working. Every photograph she took came out completely black, as if something was deliberately blocking the lens. She had taken the camera to a specialist in the city, and they had found nothing wrong with it. The camera worked perfectly when someone else used it. But when Anna held it and tried to take pictures, the sensor would malfunction. She eventually became so frightened by this that she stopped trying to use the camera altogether. Cheryl had been doing research in the historical archives of the town library, trying to find records related to the valley where we had camped on the second night of our hike. She had found something. In 1847, a settlement had been established in that valley. By 1851, it had been abandoned. The historical records were sparse and unclear about why the settlement had been abandoned so quickly, but there was one entry in a church record that caught Cheryl's attention. It was a note written by the pastor of the settlement. It read simply, "Many have been taken by the shadow that walks in the deep places. Others have abandoned their homes in fear. This place is cursed. I flee with what is left of my congregation." Joyce had stopped speaking almost entirely. She would sit in her house, moving only when necessary, staring out the windows at the forests that were visible from her property. When I visited her, she told me that she had made a terrible mistake in bringing us to those mountains. She said that her grandmother's warnings had not been sufficiently clear. She said that there were rules about the mountains that she had not fully understood, and that by bringing 6 of us into that remote valley without proper respect or understanding of the danger, she had created some kind of debt. She said that the creature was collecting on that debt. Jacob had retreated almost entirely into isolation. I was able to speak with him only once after our return from the mountains. He told me that he was leaving the Appalachian Mountains permanently. He was moving away, taking very few possessions with him. He said that he had made peace with living in the mountains for 68 years, but now he could not stay any longer. The mountains were no longer his home. Something had changed. Something was not right anymore. "The rules have been broken," he said. "By bringing Anna to document the forest with her camera, you took something from the deep places. By sleeping in that valley, you disturbed something that has been sleeping for generations. By speaking the old names and telling the old stories, Joyce and Cheryl awakened something that should have remained asleep. And now it has come back with us. It is walking in the gloom at the edges of our lives, and it will not leave until it has been satisfied." "Satisfied how?" I asked. Jacob did not answer. He simply looked at me with sad, knowing eyes, and I understood that there was no answer to that question. Or rather, there was an answer, but it was one that he was unwilling or unable to speak aloud. As for me, I have continued my work as a park ranger. I maintain my duties. I guide hikers along the trails. I make sure that people are safe. But I do not sleep well, and I have begun to notice things. I notice that when I walk the trails, the animals flee. The birds fall silent. The insects stop their humming. It is as if something is moving through the forest with me, as if I am no longer walking alone. Sometimes, at the edge of my vision, I see that darkness, that shape that Anna had captured in her photographs. It is always distant. It is always at the very edge of perception. But it is always there. I have tried to understand what we did wrong, what rule we broke, what violation of the mountain's secrets caused this thing to attach itself to us, but I cannot find an answer. Or perhaps I do not want to find it, because the answer might require me to do something about it, and I do not think there is anything that can be done. The Wampus Cat, if that is indeed what it is, does not seem to be harming us. We have not been attacked. We have not been injured. But it is there. It is always there. It is part of our lives now. It is part of the geography of our existence. Just as the mountains themselves are part of who we are, so too is this creature. So too is this curse. Nicholas took his own life on a Tuesday in November. He drove his car off a mountain road in a location that was not far from where we had camped on that second night. The police found no evidence of mechanical failure or skid marks that would suggest an accident. They concluded that it was deliberate, that Nicholas had simply driven off the road with the intent of not stopping. I did not attend his funeral. I could not face the people who knew him and answer their questions about what happened. But I went to the location where he died, and I stood at the edge of that cliff, looking out over the mountains. And I saw the shape moving through the darkness below, in the valleys and hollows, walking through the night forest as if it owned it. I do not know why I am writing this account. No one has asked me to. No one will believe it. But I feel compelled to record what happened, to ensure that there is a record of it somewhere, perhaps as a warning to others, perhaps simply as a testament to the fact that what happened was real. I can only advise you this. If you ever find yourself in the Appalachian Mountains, if you ever venture into the remote valleys and deep forests where few people go, respect them, respect the silence, respect the absence of animals, respect the old stories and the old warnings. Because the mountains belong to more than just the visible world. There are things that live there that do not want to be disturbed. There are rules that have been followed for longer than any of us have been alive. And if you ever see that darkness, if you ever catch a glimpse of that shape at the edge of your vision, do not follow it. Do not try to understand it. Do not break whatever rules are meant to protect you from it, because once it knows you, it will not forget you. It will follow you back to civilization. It will walk at the edges of your life. It will wait, and I cannot tell you what it will do when it decides that the time for waiting has ended. The letter came on a Thursday morning in late July, forwarded 3 times through addresses I had not lived at in years. My sister Catherine found it in her mailbox and called me that same day, her voice carrying the kind of excitement that comes only once in a season when something old and forgotten suddenly reaches back to touch the present. Our Uncle Samuel was retiring from the National Forest Service after 47 years. He was taking one final expedition into the deep valleys of eastern Kentucky, the hollows and gorges where he had spent his youth before becoming a ranger. He wanted family to join him. He wanted to walk the ridgelines one last time and camp beneath the stars where the mountains still held their secrets close. I said yes before thinking. Catherine said yes without hesitation. We called our friends. Julie McDonald, who worked with me at the insurance firm and complained every winter about the cold, decided to risk 2 weeks of unpaid leave. Patrick Cruz, my oldest friend since college, heard the plan and said he would bring his girlfriend Teresa Marshall, a woman I had met only twice but who seemed capable and steady. Samuel wanted numbers. He wanted company. He wanted witnesses to his final goodbye to the land that had raised him. We arrived at the trailhead on a Saturday morning in August. The parking area was empty except for Samuel's truck, a weathered Chevy that had carried him through decades of ranger duties. The old man himself stood by the gate, leaning on a staff of hickory wood he had carved in his garage. At 72 years old, he moved with the deliberate grace of someone who knows the forest will wait for no one. But he had learned long ago not to rush. I remember the way the light fell through the hemlocks that morning. I remember thinking it looked clean, almost sacred, the kind of golden hour that makes you believe in something larger than yourself. Samuel smiled when he saw Catherine first. He pulled her into an embrace that made her seem like a girl again, though she was 64 and carried her own weight of years. "This place still remembers us," Samuel said. He was looking not at Catherine but at the ridgeline beyond, at the blue shadows of distant peaks. "The question is whether we should still remember it." I asked him what he meant by that. He only shook his head and handed me a map printed on waterproof paper, marked with a route that would take us deep into terrain that few people ever visited. The national forests were vast, he explained, but this particular hollow was special. It had been sacred ground to the Cherokee before the removals. It had been hunting ground to pioneers who learned to fear what lived in the thick places. And it had been his refuge for more than 40 years. "There are things about this land you cannot know until you walk it," Samuel said. "Things it chooses to show you." Patrick arrived with Teresa at noon. Julie drove up in her sedan, which she parked with obvious reluctance in the dirt lot, waving at the dust clouds as though they were something poisonous. We loaded our gear methodically, 5 backpacks in Samuel's pack, each one heavy with supplies for 10 days in the wilderness. We had filtered water systems, dried food, medical kits, sleeping bags rated for mountain cold even though it was still summer. We had flashlights and matches and rope and first aid trainers. We had every tool we had thought might protect us. None of it would matter. None of it would make one bit of difference. We started walking at 2 in the afternoon, climbing steadily through rhododendron thickets and past stands of Fraser fir. The trail was well maintained at first, marked with white blazes on the dark tree trunks. Samuel walked point, setting a pace that was sustainable but deliberately slow. He wanted us to notice things. He pointed out hemlock flowers, birds I could not name, the track of a black bear pressed into the soft earth near a stream. "This forest is a story," Samuel said, "and we are reading it letter by letter." By evening we had climbed to 5,000 feet. The air was cooler. The light was starting to fail in that particular way that mountains make time uncertain. We made camp in a clearing near a spring, the water running clean and cold from the rocks. We filtered it into containers. We built no fire. Samuel had been explicit about that. No fires, no loud noises, no disturbances beyond what we absolutely needed. "The wilderness does not mind our presence," he said, "but it resents our arrogance." That first night I slept poorly. The ground was hard despite the foam pad beneath my bag. The temperature dropped further than I had expected. But more than any physical discomfort, I was aware of the silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. All around us in that darkness, things were moving. Small things mostly: deer, raccoons, possums. The tiny explosions of nightlife that the mountains maintain even in their remoteness. Catherine slept soundly enough. I could hear her breathing from 3 feet away, steady and deep, the sleep of someone who felt safe. Patrick and Teresa had set their tent 20 yards distant, and Julie had another position beyond that. Samuel sat on a rock near the edge of the clearing for what seemed like hours. I watched him from my sleeping bag, this old man silhouetted against the last fading light, and wondered what he was looking at, what he was listening for. "You should sleep," he said finally, though he had not turned to look at me. "I am not tired," I replied. "That is not what I meant. You should sleep because tomorrow the mountains will show you things that waking cannot prepare you for." I did not understand him then. I would spend weeks after everything happened wishing I had demanded he explain what he meant. But in that moment I simply closed my eyes and tried to find rest in the thin, cold air of the hollows. Nothing came to take me that first night, though I heard something pass through the camp around 3 in the morning. Something large enough to crack branches. Something that did not sound exactly like any animal I knew. Samuel was awake. I saw him sitting upright, and when the sound stopped, he lay back down as if he had been expecting it all along. By morning, the fear had faded into doubt, which is how fear always survives in the daylight. Perhaps it was a deer, perhaps a young elk. The mountains are full of things that make noise, and we are full of ideas about what those things might be. We packed quickly and moved deeper. The trail began to descend now, heading down into the heart of the hollow. The vegetation grew thicker. The hemlocks were older, some of them so large that I could not see the top when I looked up from the base. Samuel kept stopping and waiting for us to catch up, and each time he pointed out some detail of the landscape. A cairn of stones that had been stacked by human hands decades before. A blazed tree where the blaze had almost healed over, the National Forest Service mark becoming abstract, becoming meaningless. The remnants of an old timber camp, collapsed into rotting logs and rusted metal. "This land remembers," Samuel said. "It keeps a record of everyone who comes here, and it decides what to do with that record." Julie asked if he was being poetic or literal. "Yes," he said. "We found the shelter that evening just before dark. It was a 3-sided structure built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. The wooden walls weathered silver by 80 years of mountain storms. There was space for all of us, dry storage beneath a raised platform, a fire ring that had been used so many times it had become almost a sculpture. "We stay here 2 nights, Samuel announced. "Tomorrow we rest, tomorrow we explore, tomorrow the hollow shows itself." That evening we built a fire. Samuel had changed his instructions about this, and no one questioned him. Perhaps he understood that fear grows in complete darkness, and that sometimes a fire is necessary not just for warmth, but for the maintenance of sanity. We ate dehydrated meals that tasted primarily of salt and regret. Julie complained about the lack of proper coffee. Patrick and Teresa sat close together, watching the flames. Catherine helped Samuel organize the supplies, moving with the easy familiarity of family who have weathered many seasons together. I watched the forest beyond the firelight. I watched for shapes. I watched for the suggestion of eyes, or teeth, or claws. I watched for the moving line of shadow that would indicate something large was moving parallel to us through the trees. It was around 10 o'clock when we heard the sound. Not the sound of a deer, not the sound of any animal we knew. It was a low rhythmic noise, almost like something being dragged through brush, almost like something with long claws scoring the bark off trees. It came from somewhere up the slope, beyond the reach of our firelight, and it did not stop. "What is that?" Julie's voice had lost its daylight confidence. Samuel did not answer. He was staring into the darkness with an expression I could not read. Sadness, perhaps, or resignation. "Go inside," he said finally. "All of you, now." We did not argue. We gathered our things and moved to the shelter. Samuel remained by the fire, feeding it wood, watching the forest. Patrick and I took turns at the entrance, watching the old ranger, watching the dark. The sound continued, intermittent and impossible to locate. Sometimes it seemed close, sometimes it faded into distance. By the time midnight came, I had convinced myself it was the wind. The wind through a chasm, perhaps, or the wind against the peaks, creating an optical illusion of sound, a phantom noise born from our collective anxiety. But I did not believe it. Even then, I did not believe it. Samuel came inside as the fire was dying. He lay down on one of the bunks without speaking. I heard him say something very quietly, words that sounded like a prayer or a confession. Catherine asked if he was all right. He said only that tomorrow would bring clarity, and that some things could not be known until they were seen. The morning came cold and clear, the kind of morning where the sunlight seems to burn away everything uncertain from the night before. Samuel was awake before dawn, drinking black coffee from a metal cup, looking out at the hollow like he was reading something written in the morning mist. Julie wanted to turn back. She wanted to hike out immediately, return to civilization, forget that this expedition had ever happened. But Catherine talked her down. Samuel was calm. Samuel was rational. Samuel had been coming to these mountains for nearly 50 years. Whatever that sound had been, it was part of the natural world, and natural things, by definition, were survivable. I did not fully believe her logic, but I was grateful for it. I was not ready to leave. Something in me wanted to understand what was happening. Something in me wanted to stay close to Samuel, because he alone seemed to have some framework for what the mountains might contain. We spent the day exploring. Samuel led us down the hollow on a trail that was barely visible, marked only by his occasional gesture and his footsteps on the soft earth. The forest here was different. The canopy was so thick that even at noon, the light came only in scattered patches. The air was cooler and carried a smell I could not identify, something green and ancient and wrong. Not the clean smell of pine or earth, but something underneath, something that suggested rot and stagnation. "This is old growth," Samuel explained as we walked. "This forest has not been cut since the first settlers came. There are trees here that are older than the United States as a nation. The Cherokee knew them, the pioneers feared them, and they are still here, still growing, still keeping their secrets." Patrick asked what kind of secrets a forest could keep. "The kind that move at night," Catherine said quietly. She was walking between Patrick and Teresa, her voice carrying an edge I had not heard before. "The kind that have names in the old languages, the kind that our people learned to live alongside without looking directly at them." I realized that Catherine had known something about this place before we arrived. I realized that the women in my family, Samuel and Catherine and whoever had told Catherine these things, carried knowledge that had been deliberately withheld from the men. "The Talipo," Samuel said finally. "That is what the old settlers called it. Part panther, part something else entirely. Something that does not have a name in English because naming it would make it real, would bind it more completely to this world." Julie stopped walking. "You are not serious. You cannot possibly be suggesting that we are looking for some kind of cryptid folklore creature." "I am not suggesting anything," Samuel replied. "I am describing what lives in this hollow. Whether you believe in it or not is immaterial. It believes in itself, and it knows we are here." We came to a waterfall around noon. The water fell from a height of perhaps 60 feet, dropping into a pool so deep and clear that you could see 20 feet down into the black water. The surrounding rocks were slick with moss and with something else, a kind of dark slime that looked organic and active. "People used to die here," Samuel said conversationally. "Before the trail was marked, before this was a wilderness area maintained by the government, people would slip on these rocks and fall into the water. The pool is deep enough to swallow swimmers whole. If your body went down into that blackness, the forest would keep it." Patrick asked a practical question about how Samuel knew this history. "The Cherokee kept records," Samuel said. "Not written records, but stories. Stories passed down through families. I married a woman from the Eastern Band before her family moved her away. I learned their history while I learned theirs, and they told me about this place. They told me that the Talipo comes to waterfall places because it hunts creatures that come to drink. And it hunts humans too, if the humans are foolish enough to enter its territory without respect." "And we have entered its territory without respect?" I was hearing my own voice as though it belonged to someone else. "We have entered it," Samuel said. "As for respect, I think that will be determined by what happens next." We returned to the shelter as the sun was descending. Samuel was moving more slowly now, and I noticed he was favoring his left leg, though he had shown no signs of injury. Catherine kept asking if he was all right. He kept saying that he was simply tired, that the walking had caught up with him, that age was finally settling into his bones. That night, I noticed something I had missed before. The shelter had scratches on the interior walls, long parallel lines scored into the wood, and not recent scratches. These marks were old, weathered by time and exposure. They looked like they had been made by something with multiple claws, something that had pulled itself along the wooden surface with deliberate force. I showed them to Catherine. She looked at the marks for a long time, running her fingers along the grooves without touching them, keeping a distance of a few inches, as if the scratches themselves were dangerous. "Samuel made these," she said. "He came here alone many times. He was marking something, recording something, leaving a message." "About what?" "About the hunger of this place," she said. "About what feeds here." Patrick wanted to leave that night. He said we had seen enough, experienced enough, proven enough. He said that supernatural beliefs were remnants of a more superstitious age, and that we should depart immediately, rather than continue to engage with what was clearly either Samuel's delusion or an elaborate deception designed to test our commitment to wilderness adventure. Samuel listened to him without anger or irritation. "You are free to leave," the old ranger said. "The trail back to the road is marked. A fit man can walk it in one day. Go if you wish." Patrick did not go. None of us went. We set up our evening routine as we had the night before, but this time we doubled the watch. Someone sat by the fire constantly. We kept the flames high, feeding them wood, keeping back the darkness. Around midnight, it began to rain. A cold rain that seemed to come from nowhere, no clouds preceding it, just the sudden opening of the sky above us. And in the sound of the rain and the thunder, I heard something else. The same dragging sound from the previous night, but closer now, much closer. This time the sound was not distant. It was just beyond the range of the firelight, perhaps 50 feet away, scraping at the earth, pulling something heavy through the forest, something that moved with deliberate purpose, something that was circling the shelter. Julie started to cry. Teresa held her hand. Patrick stood at the entrance with a flashlight and a camp hatchet, looking absurdly fragile against the absolute darkness beyond the fire's reach. Samuel simply sat, watching the darkness with the calm of someone who had already made peace with something terrible. "It knows we are here," he said. "It has always known. That is not the question any longer. The question is whether it will be satisfied with our presence, or whether it will demand something more." "Satisfied how?" Catherine's voice was steady, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "By witness," Samuel said. "It wants us to see. It wants us to know. And most importantly, it wants us to leave this place with the knowledge, with the understanding, with the absolutely certainty that what we have encountered is real." I asked him how he knew this. "Because I encountered it before," he said. 53 years ago, when I was 17 and came to these mountains thinking I understood everything. I saw the Talipo. I saw it clearly in a moment when the darkness parted, and its body was illuminated by lightning. I saw the face of it, the intelligence in its eyes, the recognition that passed between us. I saw that it was not hunting out of hunger or aggression, but out of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or hunger for something that hunting cannot provide. "And you have been coming back," Catherine said. "Every year, for 53 years, you have been coming to this hollow, because it keeps calling to me. Because some part of me understands what it is, even though I can find no name for it in any language. Because I have been waiting for the moment when I could bring you here, when I could pass on this knowledge, this burden, this terrible understanding to people who would believe." The sound stopped around 3 in the morning. The rain cleared. The stars came out, indifferent and eternal, and Samuel, exhausted and drained, finally fell asleep, his head against Catherine's shoulder, his breathing slowing into something like peace. On the morning of the 4th day, Samuel told us that he had decided to stay behind. We were packing to move deeper into the hollow, to climb to a ridge view that Samuel wanted us to experience before we began our descent toward the trailhead. He had prepared for this expedition carefully, he explained, and he had reached the portion of it that required him to remain stationary. "I am old," he said. "My body is failing. These last few days in this place have reminded me how close I am to the end of things. I have decided that I want to spend my final days here, in this hollow, with the mountains around me, and the thing that has called to me for more than half a century finally able to approach without fear of my leaving." Catherine refused immediately. She said he was not staying here alone. She said he was not offering himself to something that we did not understand, something that might not be sapient at all but simply a predator following its nature. "I am not offering myself to anything," Samuel said calmly. "I am offering my company. I am offering the presence of someone who understands what it is and has made peace with its existence. I have been leading it in circles for 53 years, keeping it confined to this hollow, preventing it from expanding its range to places where it might be discovered, might be hunted, might be killed by people who fear what they do not comprehend. You have been protecting it," I said, understanding finally. understanding what all those years of solitary camping had meant, understanding why the scratches in the shelter, why the continuous return to this place. "I have been shepherding it," Samuel said, "as my people, before our time, shepherded many creatures that have since been driven into extinction or into hiding. I have been performing a duty to this land and to the thing that claims it as its own, and now it is time to hand that duty to someone else." Julie said no, absolutely no. She wanted out immediately, wanted to hike out regardless of Samuel's condition, wanted nothing more to do with any of this. Patrick agreed. He said this was insane, that we should contact the Forest Service, that we should report that Samuel was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. He said we should not enable his fantasy by pretending along. But Catherine said nothing. She was looking at Samuel with an expression I could not quite read. And after a long moment, she sat down and asked him what needed to happen, what the duty involved, what we would need to understand. "Very little," Samuel said. "You need only to agree that you will return to this place once every year. You need only to spend a night or two in this hollow, making your presence known, reminding the thing that claims this land that humans exist here in service to its survival rather than its destruction. You need only to remain silent about what you know, to tell no one, to write no accounts that could be verified." I asked him if he would be alive when we returned. "Almost certainly not," Samuel said. "I have made my peace with that. This hollow will keep my body. The forest will return it to whatever components it contains. I will become part of the mechanism that has held this place for 10,000 years and will hold it for 10,000 more after we are all gone." Catherine began to cry then, the first tears I had seen her shed in all the days since we arrived. But she nodded, she agreed. And in that agreement I understood that she had been preparing for this moment, that Samuel had written to her months before, that this expedition had never been a goodbye but a transition. Patrick and Teresa left first thing the next morning. Julie went with them, her face gray with fear and disgust, refusing to speak to any of us. The three of them descended the trail with their packs, moving quickly, disappearing into the forest, returning to a world where these things were not possible, where rationality held supreme authority. Catherine and I remained for 5 more days. We stayed in the shelter, we walked the hollow during daylight hours. We watched Samuel eat and drink and slowly become something less present with each passing day. He was not sick in any conventional sense. There was no disease, no obvious affliction. He was simply becoming detached from this plane of existence, settling into some kind of communion with the place and the thing that inhabited it. On the evening of the 5th day, he asked me to walk with him to the waterfall. The walk took several hours, and he moved very slowly, stopping frequently to catch his breath. The sun was descending as we reached the water. "I want you to understand something," he said, standing at the edge of the pool. "The Talipo is not evil, it is not malevolent, it is simply hungry. Hungry not for flesh but for acknowledgement, for recognition that it exists, that it has a place in this world, that it matters. That hunger has driven it to circle this hollow for more centuries than we can imagine, taking what few humans it encounters, trying to convince them of its reality before taking their understanding with them into death." "You have seen people die," I said. It was not a question. "I have seen what remains after death takes them," Samuel said. "I have found bones in this hollow that have been here for decades or longer. I have seen the work of something that feeds on understanding itself, that learns by consuming the knowledge of others. And I have decided that my final act, my final purpose, will be to offer myself to it completely. To place my entire 72 years of experience and knowledge into its understanding, so that perhaps it will finally achieve satiation, so that perhaps it will be satisfied and stop taking others." I understood then what he wanted from Catherine and me. He wanted us to confirm that we had understood. He wanted us to commit to returning, to maintaining a connection to this hollow, to ensure that the attention of the world never turned its full light into this place. He wanted us to be guardians, as he had been a guardian. I told him I agreed. I told him I would return. I told him that I understood what he was asking and that I accepted the weight of it. On the morning of the 6th day, Samuel did not wake up. Catherine and I found him in his bunk, his body still warm, his expression peaceful. There was no mark on him, no sign of violence or struggle. He had simply closed his eyes and decided not to open them again. We left him there. We did not call for help. We did not report his death to the authorities. We simply packed our remaining gear and began the descent toward the trailhead, following the marked trail, returning to the world of rational explanations and logical consequences. That was 8 years ago. I have returned to the hollow every year since then, always with Catherine, always for 3 days, always leaving offerings of supplies and food, always spending at least one night in the shelter, making our presence known, renewing our commitment to what Samuel placed in our hands. And every year, I see something in the forest that I cannot quite identify. Every year I hear the dragging sound that has no source. Every year the mountains remind me that there are places in this world that do not belong to humanity. Places where other things hold dominion. Places where some bargains have been made and some prices have been paid. Last year, a hiker was found dead in a ridge valley about 4 miles from the hollow. The rangers said he had fallen, that his injuries were consistent with a long tumble down steep terrain. But I know what the injuries really meant. I know what he had seen in the hours before his death. I know that the Talipo had taken him as it took all who stumbled into its territory without proper respect, without understanding, without someone to guide them through the darkness. I do not know if Samuel's sacrifice has truly satisfied it. I do not know if the hunger he spoke of has been eased or simply redirected. I do not know if the price we pay each year through our return, through our witness, through our silence, is enough to keep it contained. I know only that I will return this year, as I have returned every year. I know that Catherine is beginning to age in the way that guardians of terrible secrets age, carrying weight that cannot be shared with the world outside this hollow. I know that we are slowly becoming like Samuel, that we are settling into our role, that we are understanding that some of us are chosen to maintain the boundaries between the world we know and the world that exists beneath it, hidden in the mountains, waiting in the darkness. And I know that someday, perhaps soon, I will need to bring someone else to this place. I will need to pass this knowledge on to another person who can shoulder the burden of understanding. I will need to find someone who can accept that there are things in the wilderness that hunt us in ways we cannot defend against, that can only be managed through witness and through covenant. The question is whether, when that moment comes, I will have the strength to do what Samuel did, whether I will be able to set aside another person to act as guardian when my time comes to rest in this hollow forever. The mountains are waiting. They have all the time in the world, and they are very patient with those of us who have agreed to serve them.